Welcome to Cause Before Symptom, uncovering the real cabal and spiritual forces that are controlling the world. And now, here is your host, James Carner.
Welcome to Cause Before Symptom. I'm your host, James Carner, and today is May 26th, 2026. And tonight's episode is all about the public war against nicotine while science quietly studies the receptors. You know, for decades, the public has been taught a very simple story about nicotine: addiction, disease, dependence, and death. Well, the molecule became inseparable from cigarettes, while governments, media campaigns, and public health systems focused almost entirely on smoking-related harm. But beneath that public narrative, another story quietly unfolded inside neuroscience labs, immunology journals, and bioelectronic medicine research. Well, scientists began discovering that nicotine interacts with a massive receptor network already built into the human body. The nicotinic acetylcholine disease. Well, at the same time, the modern world suddenly shifted towards aggressive anti-nicotine policies under the banner of youth vaping epidemics and public safety. Well, while the public war focused on flavored vapes and addiction, pharmaceutical companies and research institutions quietly accelerated research into vagus nerve stimulation, cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathways, HRV monitoring, A7 receptor agonists, and bioelectronic medicine designed to manipulate the exact same pathways nicotine interacts with naturally. Well, this show doesn't argue that smoking is healthy or that nicotine is harmless. Instead, it investigates a deeper contradiction. Why is the public conversation about nicotine so simplistic while the underlying science becomes more complex every single year? What exactly did researchers discover about the nervous system's role in inflammation? And why are vagus nerve stimulators now being implanted into patients while nicotine receptors are simultaneously demonized in public discourse? And did nicotine accidentally expose one of the most important hidden systems in the human body? The electrical regulation of inflammation itself? Ooh, tonight's going to be a good story. I am looking forward to it. And I've got data to back it up, folks. Shout out to everybody on the live chat rumble. Number one warrior is Scorpion. He says, hey, Pastor and Warrior family, glad to be back. Smoke them if you got them. Well, smoking is another thing, but you know, nicotine, lozenges, and gum, I think it may keep you not sick. I can't prove it, but I'm telling you. I don't know if you guys know this or not, but 5 years ago, I quit smoking cigars and just started nicotine gum. And I just so happened to start taking 5,000 IUs of vitamin D. Vitamin D, nicotine gum. I haven't had a cold or the flu or even COVID at all since. So I was curious. What in the hell? Saw a video of a dude saying, hey, it looks like a bunch of countries are banning nicotine. Looks like depopulation numbers are way down. Got to get those numbers back up. So, yeah. Number two warrior is Boots Hafner. Boots says, all right. From the powder room, hello, James and Warrior family. Hoping everyone is well, and let's all hit that thumbs up button and check out ElitePotion.com. Thank you. Thanks for the reminder, Boots. Yeah, ElitePotion.com. Get rid of parasites and heavy metals. Chew nicotine gum and take vitamin D, and you'll be just fine. That's pretty much it. But, boy, what an industry we would kill if everyone knew this, right? It would take a lot of money out of the pockets of demons. And also, if you could do me a favor, follow my thumb because I do it with you. This is my phone. I watch you guys on this, on the live chat rumble. If you could do me a favor, I need everyone to hit the thumbs up button. So take your thumb, follow me, go to the X button, then hit thumbs up. Thank you. And then hit live chat. Hey, I'll be happy. Thanks for the reminder, Boots Hafner. And number 3 warrior is Robert Gertison saying, hi, everyone. Grateful to be here to learn the truth in nicotine. Well, you're going to learn it. It's true. Number 4 warrior is Philip Del Piano saying, hello, good evening, everyone. James, Scorpion, Boots, Robert Gertison, everybody, love y'all. Philip also says, nicotine, the COVID cure, Dr. Artis. Well, it's looking like, it's not a cure. Okay, we're going to learn this. It doesn't cure anything. It just stops inflammation and pushes back the virus from getting you sick. So it doesn't cure it. It's you're if you get the flu, if you get COVID, you're going to get it, but you're not going to feel the symptoms because your body isn't reacting to it. It's basically saying, I know what this is, and I can kill that easy. When in the opposite, if you don't have it in your system, nicotine, vitamin D, your body will be like, oh, God, help me. And then it'll just go on full-on inflammatory mode. That's what we're going to be learning tonight. So there you have that. Number 5 warrior is Graveyard. Graveyard says, hi, James. Been a while, but always supporting. Thank you. Says, hoping your family are doing good and everyone is in the chat. Amen. Thank you so much, Graveyard. Appreciate you being here. Number 6 warrior is Edged, the man with the dancing bananas. He's here and he says, hi, everyone. And Philip gives a thumbs up. Guys, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it. Let's get into breaking news.
Welcome to Shitty Breaking News with your host, James Carter, offering his shitty opinion.
MAGA candidate Paxton defeats Senate stalwart Cornyn in Texas primary. Well, it looks like it's going to be a red wave here, and the Democrats aren't too happy about it. Well, look, again, left and right. It's the same wings of the same bird, 2 wings, 1 bird. They're all working together, sort of, and yes and no. It's such a complicated thing, but when it comes to anyone working in government, well, they're going to not listen to the people and listen to corporations. So just keep that in mind. Nippon Dynawave Packaging Company chemical tank implosion kills at least 1 dead and 9 injured at a paper mill in Washington State. Pulp. It was pulp. It was a chemical tank explosion in Washington. Hey, did we not just have a show last night about disaster economics? Well, Washington basically followed up with my theory and just nipped it in the bud, said, yeah, we're going to do this. Oregon will follow. All blue states would be like, hey, we need federal funding because we're broke. That's because left policies, they know that we print money, so they're just going to grab money. But right policies, they try to conserve money. None of them work because, hey, if you can't stop the greed, right? Why don't we work on removing greed out of our DNA instead of, I don't know, doing it the way we're doing it now. But I digress. Yeah, so another economic explosion for Washington, which means they're going to get federal funding for this emergency. And federal funding comes tax-free, duty-free, don't have to pay it back. Thanks for the federal emergency funds. This is America 101 now. Thanks to the Democrats, because they're the ones that started this in the disaster economy. Because, hey, once they started it, now they can't stop it, and it makes so much money. Well, that's what we have to get used to. It's basically, we could call it apocalypse economics. Because I'm sorry, but I don't buy that all this shit is just, occurring naturally. I just don't. Yeah, I get it. Our infrastructure sucks. Yeah. Whatever. And it's just, with a dying infrastructure and everything. Yeah, come on, dude. It's just nonstop, just boom after boom after boom after boom after boom, and it just so happens to be in states that owe a lot of freaking money, and it makes sense to me that they would, do something about it. Houston area election results for the Texas primary runoffs. Well, the Reds winning more than the Blue. Democratic Republican or Representative Al Green unseated by Representative Christian Menefee in the Texas primary. Well, let's see. Who is it? NBC News projects that Menifee defeated Green after GOP-led redistricting efforts forced them to run for the same slice of Houston. Yeah. Well, anyway. So, yeah. I guess these are both Democrats. Yeah. Christian Menifee defeated longtime Representative Al Green in the Democratic primary runoff in Texas' 18th congressional district. Well, if I were Texas, I would, well, it's all about money. So Texas doesn't care. They're like, hey, China can get us money. We'll put in blue people. That's pretty much what it is. So Southern California officials lift all evacuation orders for residents near damaged chemical tank. So after I did the story last night, Southern California's damaged chemical tank, mysteriously, it stopped being a danger zone because, well, we caught him in the act. But Washington wasn't paying attention, so Washington went ahead and blew up one of their own fucking pulp machines. Look, I don't care. I just don't. I'm just a hick from Oregon, just doing a show, making no money on this. I have no agenda other than exposing evil. That's just what I do. And I think it's hilarious that literally I do that show. I know it's not like California was watching my show, but, you know, it was kind of the irony and the timing was just so funny. It's like, yep, they're going to blow it up. They need funds. And then all of a sudden they're like, whoa, stop. I wish that I had that kind of effect on America, but I doubt it. But I know Washington, they weren't involved. They weren't paying attention. They blew some shit up. South Carolina redistricting Senate passes a new map defying Trump. They're like, fuck you. We're going to go blue, and that's what they're doing. Look, hey, man, politics means to control a group of people. Let's not worry too much about that, okay? America, you've had your fun. We'll just see what happens after this, but I'm telling you, they're not working for the people. So quit relying on government to solve all of your problems. All right, when we come back, we're going to be talking about the public war against nicotine, while science quietly studies receptors. You're like, I really didn't know. How are we supposed to know?
Every year, millions of Americans sign a contract they don't even know exists. They think it's just another tax return, but that signature means something far deeper. It starts with that first job at 16. The system takes a piece of her check, then promises to give some back if she signs the return. Every April 15th, the same cycle repeats, not by law, but by belief. The system didn't bind them, their own signature did. Learn the truth at unincorporatedassociations.com.
Why do 75% of people feel exhausted all the time? The answer might surprise you. In the 1920s, Standard Oil decided to dive into medicine. They pushed synthetic petroleum into our drugs. Sure, it masked symptoms, but it wrecked our guts. Our good bacteria, which fight off parasites and heavy metals, got wiped out by crude oil. But here's the good news. We can fix this by going back to nature. Introducing Elite Potion, the world's top detox program. It restores your good bacteria by removing toxic threats like aluminum, strontium, barium, and parasites. Imagine feeling energized and alive again. They said there couldn't be a pill that did it all. We invented it. Visit elitepotion.com and reclaim your health from synthetic pharmaceuticals. Your body will thank you.
All right, we're back. The public war against nicotine, while science quietly studies the receptors. Well, tonight is going to be uncomfortable for some people because this show sits directly in the middle of two worlds that normally never speak to each other. On one side is the public world of headlines, regulations, anti-vaping campaigns, warning labels, addiction studies, and public health messaging. On the other side is the scientific world, quietly buried inside neuroscience journals, immunology papers, vagus nerve research, bioelectronic medicine, and receptor studies most people will never read. Well, I did. And the deeper this investigation went, the stranger the contradiction became. Now, for decades, the public has been taught a very simple story about nicotine. Nicotine was framed as the villain, the poison, the hook, the molecule responsible for dependence and disease. Entire generations grew up hearing that nicotine itself was little more than a chemical trap designed to keep people addicted to cigarettes. And to be fair, the tobacco industry earned much of that distrust. Smoking absolutely devastated millions of lives. Lung cancer, COPD, emphysema, vascular disease, heart damage, and decades of corporate deception permanently poisoned the public conversation around anything connected to tobacco. But something unusual happened when researchers began separating nicotine from combustion itself. Scientists started discovering that nicotine was interacting with one of the most important signaling systems inside the human body, the nicotinic acetylcholine. Acetylcholine. The God, man. It looks like acetylcholine. Acetylcholine. Well, that's a receptor system. And it's not just in the brain, but it's throughout the nervous system, immune system, the gut, your spleen, your lungs, your inflammatory tissues, and autonomic nervous system. And sitting at the center of this growing field was a receptor now appearing across studies involving inflammation, cytokine storms, PTSD, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, rheumatoid arthritis, depression, long COVID, neurodegeneration, and vagus nerve signaling itself. The alpha 7 nicotinic acetylcholine. Oh my God, receptor. Yeah, I know I sound like a dick. Can't help it. And that is where the story changes completely. Because modern media will say, no, this isn't true. We're not trying to depopulate. Because while the public conversation remained frozen in the language of addiction and vaping, the scientific world quietly, without you knowing, unless you dug, like I do, quietly began studying the exact receptor pathways that nicotine activates. Researchers started mapping what they now call the cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway. Now, the discovery that the nervous system itself may regulate inflammation electrically through vagus nerve signaling and nicotinic receptors, well, in other words, the immune system and nervous system may not be separate systems at all. They may be one integrated communication network. And suddenly, nicotine stopped looking like a simple stimulant. Now, to be very clear tonight, the show is not telling people to smoke. I'm not saying light them up. Boots. It is not also claiming that nicotine cures disease. It doesn't cure anything. But, well, for 5 years, I've been chewing nicotine gum and popping vitamin D, and I haven't gotten sick. So we're also not pretending that there are no risks, because chronic nicotine exposure absolutely affects blood vessels, receptor sensitivity, your heart rate, your blood pressure, your sleep, and dependence pathways. Well, hey, You got to take the bad with the good, right? You chew your nicotine gum, don't get colds, flus, but eventually your heart rate and your blood pressure, and you're not going to get any sleep. But hey, what this show is asking is far more uncomfortable than that. Why is the public conversation about nicotine so unbelievably simplistic, while the scientific literature surrounding nicotinic receptors becomes more advanced every single freaking year? When COVID came out, all of a sudden, research came out saying, hey, nicotine blocks COVID. It just stops it from growing. Well, because while governments publicly wage war against nicotine under the banner of youth vaping epidemics, pharmaceutical companies and research institutions are quietly investing billions into the vagus nerve stimulators, alpha 7 receptor agonists, HRV monitoring, neuroimmune therapies, cytokine suppression systems, and bioelectronic medicine designed to manipulate the exact same pathway that simple nicotine interacts with naturally. Well, the public war is against nicotine. The scientific race is toward the receptors, because they're not going to want you to chew nicotine gum to not get the cold or flu or even COVID. They want you to buy their shit. And that contradiction alone should force people to slow down and think carefully. Do it on your own. Quit relying on me. Do your own homework. And then there's another layer to all of this that makes the story even stranger. Many people, including myself, and many in this audience, began noticing something unusual long before ever reading these papers. Some people using nicotine gum, pouches, or smokeless nicotine products noticed fewer illnesses, reduced brain fog, calmer nervous systems, sharper focus, or altered inflammatory systems. Well, most dismissed it because the public narrative had already been settled decades ago. Science is settled. Well, nicotine was bad. End of discussion. Oh, anytime they say science is settled, there's money involved. Except science did not stop studying it. Instead, researchers kept uncovering evidence that these receptors may play enormous roles in regulating inflammation itself. Influenza, the flu, studies showed nicotine sometimes reduced inflammatory injury in the lungs. PTSD studies linked alpha 7 receptor dysfunction to trauma and cytokine imbalance. Alzheimer's studies found amyloid proteins interacting directly with nicotinic receptors. Rheumatoid arthritis researchers discovered vagus nerve stimulation could suppress inflammatory cytokines through cholinergic signaling pathways. Long COVID, researchers began investigating whether dysregulated nicotinic systems could contribute to fatigue, brain fog, and autonomic dysfunction, or autonomic dysfunction. And through all of it, the same pattern kept appearing over and over again. The simple nicotine actually works. The nervous system controls far more of the immune system than medicine previously understood. And that may be the real revelation hidden underneath all of this bullshit. Not that nicotine is magical, not that smoking was healthy, but that modern science may have accidentally rediscovered one of the body's master regulatory systems, the electrical control of inflammation through neural signaling. Well, tonight we're going to follow that story carefully, calmly, and step by step. We are going to separate smoking from receptor science. We are going to examine the vagus nerve, the inflammatory reflex, alpha 7 nicotinic receptors, trauma neurodegeneration, autoimmune disease, like AIDS, and the emerging world of bioelectronic medicine. And by the end of tonight's show, the question may no longer be whether nicotine is good or bad. The real question may be whether the nervous system itself is one of the hidden control systems behind chronic disease, inflammation, and human health. Well, the public war against nicotine did not begin with neuroscience. It began with smoke. For most of the 20th century, cigarettes became one of the largest commercial industries on earth. One of the largest. And doctors smoked in advertisements. Athletes promoted cigarette brands. Television, movies, magazines, and radio all normalized smoking until it became deeply woven into modern culture. Science has settled smoking is good for pregnancy. But while the public consumed cigarettes by the billions, something darker was happening underneath the surface. Lung cancer rates exploded. Heart disease climbed. Chronic respiratory illness spread across entire populations. And eventually, evidence emerging that showing tobacco companies had long known the dangers associated with smoking while publicly denying or minimizing the risks. Well, that betrayal permanently shaped public perception. Of course. Once the lawsuits arrived and the internal documents surfaced, nicotine itself became inseparable from the damage caused by cigarettes. Well, in the public mind, nicotine was no longer simply a stimulant. It became the symbol of addiction itself. The molecule was treated as the engine behind one of the largest public health disasters in modern history. It's nicotine, it ain't the smoke. Well, in many ways, that reaction made sense at that time, right? The problem is that the conversation eventually stopped evolving. Smoking and nicotine became treated as if they were scientifically identical, even though combustion introduces thousands of additional chemicals into the lungs and bloodstream, not including all of the pesticide shits put in the tobaccos, the 3,000 different types of chemicals that are in cigarettes. Tar, carbon monoxide, oxidants, combustion particles, and toxic byproducts all became fused together under a single public label called nicotine. No. That simplification shaped decades of public health messaging. As anti-smoking campaigns intensified through the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, the ooze, nuance disappeared almost entirely. Nicotine became framed primarily as a dependency mechanism with no meaningful biological role outside addiction. Entire generations were taught a very binary framework. Nicotine, bad. Abstinence, good. End of discussion. Well, then came vaping. Suddenly, nicotine delivery escaped traditional cigarettes and entered flavored cartridges, disposable devices, nicotine salts, pouches, and vapor systems. Teen usage surged. Social media exploded with vape culture. Popcorn lungs. Schools reported students using high-dose nicotine products in classrooms and bathrooms. Governments panicked as a new generation appeared to be developing nicotine dependence without ever touching cigarettes themselves. And once again, the public messaging collapsed into an emergency mode. Oh my God. The focus shifted toward protection of children, redistricting flavors, or restricting flavors, banning disposables, and regulating nicotine concentrations. Well, countries around the world began tightening restrictions while media headlines framed vaping as a new public health crisis. The political momentum accelerated rapidly because no government wanted to appear passive while youth nicotine was climbing. But something unusual was happening quietly underneath all of this. At the exact same time, the public war against nicotine intensified. Scientific research into nicotine, acetylcholine receptors, began expanding into entirely new areas of medicine. Researchers were publishing studies on inflammation regulation, vagus nerve signaling, cytokine suppression, neurodegeneration, PTSD, autoimmune disease, and bioelectronic medicine. Pharmaceutical companies started exploring alpha-7 receptor agonists. Probably pronouncing that one wrong. While hospitals and researchers investigated vagus nerve stimulation therapies for inflammatory disorders. Well, in other words, the public conversation and the scientific conversation were moving completely in different directions. Nicotine, bad. We are finding out it's actually stopping the flow. Well, publicly, nicotine was increasingly reduced to addiction and youth vaping. Privately, researchers were uncovering receptor systems connected to inflammation, immunity, cognition, and autonomic regulation. And that contradiction is where this investigation truly begins. Now, the deeper scientists looked into nicotine, the stranger the biology became, because nicotine was not attaching to some foreign receptor artificially created by tobacco companies. The body already had these receptors long before cigarettes ever existed. They are called nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. Acetylcholine receptors. And they are part of one of the oldest signaling systems in the human nervous system. How bizarre. Well, that changes the entire conversation immediately. Whoa, 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 whoa. Wait a minute. Politicians, nicotine bad. Medicine, nicotine is already in your body. It's receptors. What? Well, acetylcholine is one of the body's primary neurotransmitters. It helps regulate attention, learning, memory, muscle contraction, autonomic function, and communication between nerves and organs. The body naturally produces it constantly. Nicotine simply happens to mimic acetylcholine closely enough to activate certain receptors designed for that signaling system. Well, researchers eventually discovered that these receptors were not all the same. There were multiple subtypes distributed throughout the body, each with different functions and effects. Some were heavily involved in cognition and dopamine signaling. Others appeared connected to autonomic regulation, inflammation, sensory gating, or immune activity. One receptor subtype, in particular, kept appearing over and over and over again in scientific literature: the alpha-7 nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, often shortened to just simple A7 or alpha-7 or acetylcholine receptor. Now, this receptor was not limited to the brain. Scientists found A7 receptors on macrophages, microglia, immune cells, gut tissues, inflammatory cells, neurons, spleen tissue, and throughout the autonomic nervous system. Well, that discovery forced researchers to begin asking a very uncomfortable question. What if nicotine was affecting far more than addiction? Because suddenly studies started showing A7 receptors were involved in regulating inflammatory cytokines like TNF-alpha and IL-6. Well, other papers connected these receptors to neurodegenerative disease, cognition, trauma regulation, schizophrenia, PTSD, and autoimmune disorders. Researchers found alpha-7 signaling tied to something called the cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway, which is a system where neural signaling appeared capable of suppressing excessive inflammation. Well, that was a massive paradigm shift. Let me dumb it down for you. If someone sneezes on you and you get their shit in your mouth while they have a cold, influenza, or the flu, same thing, it gets in your body, and then all of a sudden your body starts to react. You start to have that feeling, that feeling like I'm getting that, something's coming on. That achy feeling, right? But then if you pop a nicotine gum, then that shit goes away because your body's saying, no. I'm not going into inflammatory mode. I'm just going to kill this shit off and move on. Massive paradigm shift here, folks. And for decades, the immune system had been treated mostly like a chemical battlefield involving pathogens, white blood cells, antibodies, and inflammatory molecules. But now, scientists were uncovering evidence that the nervous system itself was directly regulating inflammation through electrical signaling pathways. We were wrong about everything. Yeah, that's pretty much what it is. Right after you all declare science is settled. You know, you and your science religion, your science god. And nicotine happened to interact strongly with these pathways. Now, this does not mean nicotine is harmless. Okay. In fact, one reason nicotine became addictive is precisely because these receptor systems are so powerful. Chronic exposure changes receptor density, alters dopamine signaling, and creates neurological adaptation. And over time, the brain literally restructures itself around repeated stimulation. But addiction was no longer the only thing researchers were seeing. Some studies show alpha-7 activation reduced inflammatory cytokines. Others connected these receptors to attention and cognitive filtering. PTSD research found altered receptor availability in trauma patients. Parkinson's and Alzheimer's studies repeatedly intersected with cholinergic dysfunction and neuroinflammation. Rheumatoid arthritis research found alpha-7 receptor activation reduced inflammatory damage in animal models. Yeah, they're still experimenting on animals. And this is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. While the public was still being told a simplified story centered almost entirely on addiction and vaping, the scientific literature was expanding into inflammation regulation, neuroimmune signaling, autonomic nervous system balance, vagus nerve pathways, and bioelectronic medicine. Meaning, we're gonna invent a machine or a pill that'll stop all of your symptoms and kill off all the virus. See what I mean? In other words, nicotine may have accidentally exposed one of the body's hidden master control systems. Well, the communication network between the nervous system and the immune system itself. You mean those COVID deniers were right? Yeah. The breakthrough came when scientists stopped looking at inflammation as a system operating by itself and began realizing the nervous system was directly involved in regulating it. At the center of that discovery was the vagus nerve, one of the most important and mysterious nerves in the body. Now, the vagus nerve is the primary nerve of the parasympathetic nervous system, the system responsible for rest, recovery, digestion, healing, and autonomic balance. Unlike most nerves, the vagus travels throughout the body, connecting the brain to heart, lungs, gut, spleen, liver, and major organs. Researchers eventually realized this nerve was not simply carrying signals related to relaxation or digestion. It was also carrying information about inflammation itself, telling the body, you don't need to worry. We've attacked this shit before. Chill. The body goes, good, go kill it. All right, done deal. Well, that realization changed modern medicine. Quietly. Well, everyone's being told that nicotine is dangerous. One of the key figures behind this discovery was immunologist Kevin J. Tracy, whose work helped establish what is now called the inflammatory reflex. The theory was radical at the time. The immune system and nervous system were functioning together as one integrated communication network. Well, in simple terms, the body appeared capable of sensing inflammation through the vagus nerve and then responding electrically to suppress excessive inflammatory damage. Well, this became known as the cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway. Now, researchers discovered that activation of the vagus nerve triggering acetylcholine release, I have to keep saying it like that, which then activated alpha-7 nicotinic acetylcholine receptors on immune cells like macrophages. I know I even said that one wrong. Macrophages. Macrophages. Well, once activated, those receptors reduced production of inflammatory cytokines, such as a TNF-alpha, IL-1 beta, and IL-6. That was enormous because cytokines are deeply involved in autoimmune disease, sepsis, cytokine storms, chronic inflammation, rheumatoid arthritis, inflammatory bowel disease, long COVID, neurodegeneration, and many forms of chronic illnesses. This is why they had to put 3,000 more chemicals into the cigarettes to bypass all that nicotine help. Yeah, that's what I think, but I can't prove it. Suddenly, researchers were looking at the body differently. Inflammation was no longer just chemistry. It was electrical regulation too. And the evidence became increasingly difficult to ignore. They just couldn't because, well, those nasty conspiracy theorists. Studies showed that stimulating the vagus nerve reduced inflammatory damage in animal models. Cutting the vagus nerve often worsened inflammation. Activating alpha-7 receptors suppressed cytokine release. Well, researchers even found that electrical vagus nerve stimulation reduced arthritis severity and inflammatory markers in experimental models of rheumatoid arthritis. Well, this was the birth of what many researchers now call bioelectronic medicine. Don't worry, don't take the nicotine, get on this $60,000 machine. And instead of treating disease only with chemicals, scientists began exploring whether electrical signaling pathways could regulate inflammation directly. Implantable vagus nerve stimulators, HRV monitoring systems, breathing therapies, and receptor targeting drugs all emerged from this growing understanding. And this is where the nicotine re-enters the story. Because nicotine strongly activates nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, especially alpha-7 pathways tied to the cholinergic anti-inflammatory system. That does not mean nicotine is automatically healthy or therapeutic, but it does mean nicotine was interacting with the system far more important than researchers originally understood. And this is why they were confused, because there were less smokers in hospitals during COVID than there should have been. Well, in many ways, nicotine may have accidentally exposed the existence of a hidden regulatory network connecting the brain, the nervous system, inflammation, immune signaling, and chronic disease itself. And once that door opened, modern medicine began moving rapidly towards an entirely new understanding of human health. For money. Got a little spit on there. Well, this is where the nicotine conversation became explosive, because researchers moved beyond addiction studies and began asking whether nicotinic receptors might influence viral illness, inflammation, and immune overreaction itself. Let me repeat that. Immune overreaction itself, which I think is killing people. If you're not that healthy and you get immune overreaction, it can take you straight to the hospital and maybe to death. And once COVID arrived, the entire debate accelerated overnight. Why? It's because we were all fucking pissed off, angry for being shut down for a fucking flu. And we weren't told, well, chew nicotine gum and you'll be fine. Well, this is where the nicotine conversation became explosive. Because researchers moved beyond addiction studies and began asking whether nicotinic receptors might influence viral illnesses, inflammation, and immune overreaction itself. And once COVID arrived, the entire debate accelerated overnight. And the first clues actually came from influenza research years earlier. You know, Ouchie Fauci didn't read this article. In several animal studies, nicotine exposure appeared to reduce inflammatory injury during influenza infection. Mice infected with H1N1 influenza sometimes showed reduced lung inflammation, less tissue damage, and improved survival when alpha-7 nicotinic receptors were activated through nicotine gum. What shocked researchers was that the viral load itself was not always reduced. In some cases, the amount of virus remained similar to or even increased. Well, that distinction matters enormously. The studies suggested nicotine was not necessarily acting like a traditional antiviral drug. Instead, it appeared to be modifying the host inflammatory response itself. In other words, the body was reacting differently to the infection. Reacting differently. It didn't go into inflammatory mode. Oh shit, we're gonna die. Kill, kill, kill. And going after all the white blood cells. Just kill everything until it's all gone. And then you gotta start over. Well, that pointed directly back toward a cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway. If alpha-7 receptor activation suppresses excessive cytokine release, then nicotine could theoretically reduce the inflammatory overreaction responsible for much of the tissue damage seen in severe respiratory illness. Researchers became especially interested in cytokines like TNF-alpha and IL-6 because these inflammatory molecules are heavily involved in lung injury and cytokine storm responses. Then COVID appeared, and the debate exploded into public view. Early in the pandemic, some hospital data sets showed unexpectedly low numbers of smokers among hospitalized COVID patients. Researchers began proposing what became known as the nicotine hypothesis. Some theorized nicotine might interfere with receptor binding, modulate inflammation, or affect autonomic signaling pathways connected to disease severity. But almost immediately, conflicting evidence appeared. How convenient. Other studies found nicotine increased ACE2 receptor expression in lung tissue, potentially increasing vulnerability to SARS-CoV-2 infection. Researchers split into competing camps almost overnight. Bad, good, pick one. One side focused on anti-inflammatory receptor pathways and cholinergic signaling. The other focused on viral entry mechanisms and pulmonary risk. I'm not a doctor. But I also know that you can't take the data away from me when it comes to the 5 years I haven't been sick, period. The science was not simple, especially when there's money involved. Nicotine appeared capable of doing multiple things at once, altering inflammatory signaling, affecting autonomic balance, changing receptor expression, modifying cytokine production, and potentially influencing viral interaction pathways simultaneously. Meanwhile, long COVID research added another layer entirely that kind of shifted way down into millions of websites, and you'll never find it. Doctors began noticing many long COVID symptoms resembled autonomic nervous system dysfunction, brain fog, fatigue, rapid heart rate, poor concentration, sleep disruption, inflammation, and dysregulated stress responses. Well, that pushed researchers toward investigating vagus nerve dysfunction and cholinergic signaling again. Thanks for going back to it. Some scientists, they proposed that impaired nicotinic receptor function could contribute to lingering inflammatory and neurological symptoms following infection. And through all of it, one pattern kept reappearing. The nervous system seemed deeply entangled with the immune system. You see, something's weird about all these viruses that are in the public. They do more damage than they used to, right? And it couldn't be, gain of function research. No, they wouldn't do that, would they? Ouchie Fauci did. That fucker should be in jail. Not in jail, hung publicly. And through all of it, one pattern kept repeating and reappearing over and over, that the nervous system seemed deeply entangled within the immune response. Well, the important thing to understand is that this research never conclusively proved nicotine prevents influenza or cures COVID. You're going to get it, but your body is going to kill it off faster, and you're not going to have the symptoms. You're going to feel it coming on, then it goes away and dies because your body isn't freaking out anymore as it did when it gets it, because there's something in it. I'm thinking, and this is just a conspiracy theory, that this weaponized flu shit they've been throwing at us gets us to respond too much to it because it's genetically modified. That's what mankind does. But hey, what do I know? Now, this doesn't prove that this research conclusively proved nicotine prevents influenza or cures COVID. That claim goes beyond the evidence. But what the literature increasingly does support was something more nuanced and potentially far more important. The body's inflammatory response may be partially regulated through neural signaling pathways involving the vagus nerve and alpha-7 nicotinic receptors. And nicotine, for better or worse, interacts directly with that system. Boom. It's proven. I've got the paperwork. I've got the research. Wasn't hard. You just have to go find the journals from doctors who are doing this research. Now, one of the biggest discoveries emerging from this entire field is not that chronic stress and trauma do not remain trapped in the mind. They become biological. They alter inflammation, autonomic regulation, immune signaling, hormone balance, and even the way the nervous system responds to danger itself. This is where the conversation around nicotine, vagus nerve signaling, and inflammation suddenly intersects with PTSD, anxiety, depression, and trauma research. Now, for years, mental health was often separated from physical disease. Depression was framed as a chemical imbalance. PTSD was viewed mostly as psychological memory. Anxiety was treated like an emotional problem disconnected from the immune system. But modern neuroinflammation research is beginning to collapse those old boundaries. Researchers are now discovering that chronic stress activates inflammatory pathways throughout the body, and the nervous system appears to sit directly at the center of it. The autonomic nervous system constantly shifts between sympathetic activation, the fight or flight response, and parasympathetic recovery, which is controlled largely through vagus nerve signaling. When someone experiences chronic stress, unresolved trauma, or repeated fear activation, the body can become locked into a state of sympathetic overdrive. Heart rate increases, inflammatory cytokines rise, cortisol regulation changes, sleep becomes dysregulated, immune signaling shifts, recovery systems weaken. Well, over time, the nervous system itself begins adapting to survival mode. Well, this is where polyvagal theory becomes influential. Researchers like Stephen Porges, P-O-R-G-E-S, I think it's Porges, proposed that the nervous system constantly scans for cues or safety or danger. If the body perceives threats chronically, autonomic balance deteriorates. The vagus nerve loses regulatory efficiency while inflammatory stress increases throughout the body. And then the receptor studies become even more revealing. Research involving PTSD patients found altered alpha-7 nicotinic receptor availability associated with inflammatory cytokines like TNF-alpha and IL-6. In other words, trauma and inflammation were becoming biologically linked through the same receptor systems already appearing throughout the vagus nerve and immune research. Well, at the same time, psychiatrists began rethinking depression itself. Books like The Inflamed Mind helped popularize the growing theory that depression may involve inflammatory signaling as much as neurotransmitter imbalance. Microglia, the immune cells of the brain, became central to this conversation because chronic activation of these inflammatory cells appears capable of affecting mood, cognition, memory, motivation, and emotional regulation. Well, this may also explain one of the strangest characteristics of nicotine itself. Many users describe nicotine as both calming and stimulating at the same time. That sounds contradictory until viewed through autonomic regulation. Nicotine stimulates alertness and dopamine signaling, but it may also temporarily regulate stress pathways and cholinergic signaling linked to inflammation and autonomic balance. For someone trapped in chronic sympathetic overreaction or overactivation, meaning that's what these viruses are doing. They're signaling a chronic sympathetic overactivation. Like whatever's hit, it's worse than Ebola. That temporary shift can feel like relief, focus, calmness, or clarity with nicotine. Meaning the body's saying, this is not Ebola. Just chill out. So what I'm saying is, who cares if I'm wrong or right? The scientists created these viruses and made the bodies think that what's coming in is dangerous beyond all danger. And that's why the body goes into high alert and is inflamed and stays inflamed, because that's how these things approach the body. They're told to say, I'm the badass, look out, and everyone runs. It's like the bully walking into the classroom, staring at you. Well, that temporary shift can feel like relief with nicotine. And again, that does not mean nicotine is harmless. It does not mean addiction is healthy. It does not mean long-term exposure carries no risks. But hell, I'd rather do nicotine than freaking other hardcore drugs. If I'm not going to get sick, yeah, my heart rate goes a little bit faster. What's the problem here? Well, nicotine doesn't get you high and get you to forget about life, which I believe cannabis does. Now, if people are doing cannabis to relieve pain and not doing it because they want to get high, well, that's a different story. Anything is okay with moderation, but if it turns from recreation to abuse, then you've got a problem, folks. And it doesn't mean that addiction is healthy. It's not. And it does not mean that long-term exposure carries no risks. But it does suggest that many people may unconsciously be using nicotine, not only for dopamine, but for temporary nervous system regulation itself. And that possibility changes the conversation dramatically. Because now nicotine no longer sits only inside addiction science. It sits inside trauma research, neuroinflammation, autonomic dysfunction, stress physiology, and the growing realization that the immune system and nervous system may be inseparable parts of the same biological network. In comes, knocking at the door, the men in black. I'm just saying. Well, would it be great if you just ate tacos instead of, tacos suppresses the immune response, chills it all out? That'd be awesome, Scorpion. Now, as researchers pushed deeper into the cholinergic system, the conversation expanded far beyond inflammation and entered one of the most frightening areas of medicine: neurodegenerative disease. Suddenly, alpha 7 nicotinic receptors were appearing in studies involving Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, memory loss, sensory gating, and cognitive decline. And this is where the public narration around nicotine became almost impossible to reconcile with the scientific literature, meaning those who are paid to push that away from the public can't stop it anymore because it got into scientific literature. Because while nicotine remained publicly associated almost entirely with addiction, researchers quietly continued investigating nicotinic receptors as potential therapeutic targets in degenerative brain disorders. Well, in Alzheimer's disease, one of the earliest and most consistent findings is the breakdown of cholinergic signaling. Acetylcholine pathways begin deteriorating. Memory formation weakens. Cognitive processing declines, and many current Alzheimer's medications work primarily by slowing the breakdown of acetylcholine itself in an attempt to preserve cholinergic communication for as long as possible. Then researchers discovered something even stranger. Beta amyloid proteins, the same proteins associated with Alzheimer's plaque, appeared to interact directly with alpha 7 nicotinic receptors. And studies showed amyloid beta could bind to these receptors and alter cholinergic signaling pathways. And some papers suggested this interaction may contribute to the abnormal acetylcholinesterase activity seen around amyloid plaques in Alzheimer's patients. Other studies found nicotine and choline also activated these same receptor pathways. So in other words, the same receptor system tied to inflammation and autonomic regulation was now appearing directly inside neurodegenerative disease itself. Oh my God. Then Parkinson's research added a whole nother layer. Scientists increasingly began investigating the gut-brain axis, like autism, and the possibility that Parkinson's disease may partially travel along the vagus nerve from the gastrointestinal system into the brain. Inflammatory signaling, microbiome disruption, alpha synuclein proteins, and autonomic dysfunction all became part of the discussion. And once again, the vagus nerve and cholinergic pathways kept reappearing. Oh my God. At the same time, researchers studying schizophrenia noticed and marsupials, shout out the Boots, discovered and noticed something fascinating. Smoking rates among schizophrenia patients were extraordinarily high compared to the general population. Now, for years, this was dismissed as simple addiction or behavioral coping. But later studies suggested nicotine temporarily improves sensory gating and cognitive filtering deficits through alpha 7 receptor activation. Oh, shit. Well, that observation forced scientists to reconsider whether some nicotine use might partially function as unconscious neurological self-regulation in certain disorders. Again, this does not mean nicotine cures schizophrenia or prevents Alzheimer's disease, but it does reveal something critically important. Its cholinergic system appears deeply tied to cognition, memory, sensory processing, and inflammatory regulation throughout the brain. And once this realization spread, pharmaceutical companies began aggressively pursuing alpha 7 receptor agonists and cholinergic therapies aimed at reproducing beneficial signaling effects without the dependency risks associated with nicotine itself. Well, that shift matters because it reveals where the scientific world is actually heading. Not away from nicotinic receptors, toward them. And the public still hears nicotine discussed mostly through the language of addiction and vaping, while researchers increasingly study the receptor network itself as a possible key to understanding neurodegeneration, inflammatory disease, trauma, cognition, autonomic dysfunction, and aging brain. And the deeper the science goes, the more it appears that the nervous system and immune system were never truly separate to begin with. One of the most overlooked parts of this entire discussion is that the body's inflammatory control systems do not appear to depend on a single molecule or receptor alone. Instead, researchers keep finding a massive interconnected network involving sunlight, stress, movement, autonomic balance, inflammation, nutrition, vagus nerve signaling, and immune regulation. All the stuff that we used to have before they started genetically modifying our food. And sitting quietly inside that network is something that most people still think of as just a vitamin. It's vitamin D. Well, when they spray the skies, keep us sick, that's what they're doing. I mean, if you look at the most common denominational answer, the most common answer, Occam's razor, vitamin D deficiency is one of the problems of America's health. And most doctors would agree. No one's taking enough vitamin D. And we're not getting it from our sun anymore because they keep spraying shit over us. Now, you could say that, well, that's contrails. Well, you could say that, but still the contrails are blocking the sun from giving you vitamin D, so that's a health risk. Now, for decades, vitamin D was treated mainly as a bone health nutrient associated with calcium absorption and skeletal development, but they were so fucking far off. Modern research increasingly shows that vitamin D behaves far more like a hormone regulator than a simple dietary vitamin. Vitamin D receptors exist throughout the body. Immune cells, brain tissue, gut tissue, inflammatory cells, vascular tissue, and nervous system structures. Well, I'll be damned. That alone tells researchers something important. The body clearly expects vitamin D signaling to influence far more than bone density. Then studies started linking low vitamin D levels to respiratory illness, autoimmune disease, depression, chronic inflammation, fatigue, poor immune resilience, and neurodegenerative disorders. Oh, shit. And eventually, the cholinergic research intersected with vitamin D directly. And one of the papers examined in this investigation showed vitamin D supplementation restored alpha-7 nicotinic acetylcholine receptors expression while simultaneously reducing inflammatory cytokines like TNF-alpha and IL-6 in a Huntington's disease study. And the study also showed improved cholinergic signaling and reduced inflammatory stress markers. Well, that is remarkable because now the same receptor system is tied to nicotine, vagus nerve signaling, cytokine regulation, neuroinflammation, PTSD, and neurodegeneration. It's also being influenced by vitamin D status. And suddenly the modern lifestyle itself starts looking biologically disruptive. Most people spend enormous portions of their lives indoors. Artificial lighting, chronic stress, poor sleep, little sunlight, the sedimentary behavior, constant stimulation, and disrupted circadian rhythms. And at the same time, autonomic dysfunction, inflammatory disease, depression, anxiety, autoimmune illness, metabolic disorders, and chronic fatigue continue to rise across the industrialized world. And researchers are increasingly beginning to ask whether these systems are connected. Because sunlight influences vitamin D production, circadian biology, whatever the hell that is, hormone regulation, immune signaling, mitochondrial function, and autonomic balance. It also affects movement, inflammatory control, vagal tone, glucose regulation, stress adaptation, and nervous system resilience. And then breathing pattern effects. Take my breath away. Heart rate variability, parasympathetic activation, and vagus nerve signaling. Well, in other words, many of the systems modern life disrupts are the exact same systems now appearing throughout neuroimmune research. And that may explain why so many seemingly unrelated interventions often improve similar chronic conditions. Sunlight, exercise, cold exposure, meditation, diaphragmatic breathing, vagus stimulation, proper sleep, and anti-inflammatory nutrition. And they may all strengthen the body's ability to regulate inflammation and autonomic balance through interconnected neuroimmune pathways. This is why the conversation tonight was never about one molecule. Nicotine may simply have been the accidental doorway that exposed a much larger hidden system involving the nervous system, inflammation, stress regulation, immune communication, and the body's electrical control networks themselves. Now, as the scientific world began uncovering the connection between inflammation, vagus nerve signaling, and alpha 7 nicotinic receptors, pharmaceutical companies realized something immediately. If these pathways truly regulate immune response in chronic disease, then the future of medicine may no longer be purely chemical. It may become electrical. And that realization launched an entire new industry. Instead of focusing only on drugs that flood the bloodstream, researchers began exploring ways to directly manipulate the nervous system itself in order to regulate inflammation, immunity, mood, and autonomic balance. Well, this emerging field became known as bioelectronic medicine, which was pseudoscience 10 years ago. And the goal was simple but revolutionary: control disease by controlling neural signaling pathways. Oh. Suddenly, scientists were developing implanted vagus nerve stimulators, alpha 7 receptor agonists, wearable HRV tracking systems, electrical inflammatory therapies, and neuroimmune modulation devices designed to influence the exact pathways nicotine had been interacting with for decades. Well, one of the strongest examples came from the rheumatoid arthritis research. Studies showed that stimulating the vagus nerve reduced inflammatory cytokines and decreased disease severity in animal models. Researchers found that activating cholinergic signaling pathways suppressed TNF alpha production and reduced inflammatory destruction in joints. Well, that changed everything, folks. Because TNF alpha blockers are already among the largest and most profitable pharmaceutical categories in the world. Entire industries were built around suppressing inflammatory cytokines chemically. But now researchers were discovering the nervous system itself might regulate those same inflammatory pathways naturally through vagus signaling and alpha 7 receptor activation. So we don't need to take those drugs. Well, that opened the door to a completely different future. Instead of asking, what drug blocks the inflammation? Medicine began asking, what neural signal regulates the inflammation? Well, that shift explains why so many technologies suddenly emerged at the same time. All of a sudden, now we got vagus nerve implants for epilepsy and depression. Where'd that came from? HRV monitoring wearables, breath work therapies. That's what they do. It's weird. Autonomic nervous system training, neurostimulation devices, electroceuticals, and receptor-specific anti-inflammatory compounds. And quietly sitting underneath much of this research was the same receptor system nicotine activates. That is the contradiction almost nobody talks about publicly. While governments increasingly frame nicotine entirely through addiction and vaping concerns, research institutions are aggressively studying the exact receptors and cholinergic pathways nicotine interacts with naturally. So the pharmaceutical world does not appear to be moving away from nicotine receptor science. No, it appears to be racing toward it fast, quietly. Because they want to get to this before you get to the gum. The reason is obvious once the larger picture becomes visible. If inflammation sits underneath enormous categories of chronic disease, and if the nervous system regulates inflammation through electrical signaling pathways, then whoever understands those pathways may control the future of medicine itself. Yeah, Philip, I've heard of Tesla's machine, plasma healing. I already have one of the. I don't have the plasma version, but I do have a. Oh my God, what is it called? hit me soon. That is why this field matters so much. Money, money, money. And this is no longer merely about smoking cessation or nicotine dependence. It's about the possibility that chronic disease, trauma, autoimmune disorders, neurodegeneration, and inflammatory illness may all be partially regulated through hidden communication networks connecting to your nerves, your immune cells, cytokines, stress responses, and autonomic signaling. And the scientific world appears to have realized that long before the public conversation ever caught up with it. So this is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore publicly. On one side, governments and health agencies increasingly frame nicotine almost entirely through the lens of addiction, youth vaping, and public safety. They're killing the kids. On the other side, scientific institutions and pharmaceutical companies continue investing heavily into the exact receptor systems that nicotine activates. And the timing of all of this raises difficult questions. The modern anti-nicotine movement accelerated rapidly during the risk of vaping. Disposable devices flooded the market. Nicotine salts allowed much higher concentrations to be delivered more efficiently than older products. Teen usage surged through schools and social media. Governments responded aggressively because politically, protecting children is one of the fastest ways to justify sweeping regulation. Protect the children. Well, from a public health perspective, many of these concerns were legitimate. Nicotine absolutely creates dependence. Sure. Teen brains are highly sensitive to dopamine reinforcement. Doom scrolling. Chronic nicotine exposure also alters receptor density and neurological adaptation. And a generation becoming dependent on ultra-concentrated nicotine products alarmed regulators worldwide, naturally. But while the public conversation became dominated by anti-vaping campaigns, another conversation was quietly unfolding behind laboratory doors. Researchers are now studying alpha-7 nicotinic receptors, vagus nervous signaling, inflammatory reflexes, cytokine suppression, bioelectronic medicine, and autonomic dysfunction, and neuroimmune regulation. So in other words, the scientific world was becoming more interested in nicotinic pathways. At the exact same moment, public messaging became more hostile toward nicotine itself. Well, that contradiction deserves attention, because the public was largely told nicotine is the problem. Well, whenever government tells you this is wrong, meanwhile, researchers increasingly treated nicotinic receptors as therapeutic targets connected to post-traumatic stress disorder, rheumatoid arthritis, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, depression, inflammatory bowel disease, COVID, cytokine storms, and chronic inflammation. And that creates a very uncomfortable tension. If nicotinic receptor systems are genuinely involved in regulating inflammation and autonomic balance, then the public narrative surrounding nicotine may be incomplete. Not necessarily false, but definitely incomplete. See, the danger comes when societies reduce complicated biology into simplistic slogans. Because once a molecule becomes culturally demonized, nuanced scientific discussion becomes politically difficult. Researchers become cautious. Public conversations become emotional instead of analytical. And people stop separating smoking from nicotine, addiction from receptor biology, combustion damage from cholinergic signaling, and public policy from neuroimmune science. Now, this does not mean the governments are secretly hiding miracle cures. Yeah, they are. And it does not mean that nicotine is harmless. That I don't know. And it does not mean vaping companies are heroes. But it does mean modern society may be fighting a public war against nicotine while simultaneously racing toward the receptor system nicotine exposed decades ago. And that paradox may define the next era of medicine. Because once researchers realized the nervous system could regulate inflammation electrically, well, the conversation stopped being about smoking entirely. Now it's about control of the body's hidden communication networks themselves. And believe me, the first one that comes out with it patents it, and then boom, trillionaires. And by the time all these threads are pulled together, the real revelation is no longer about nicotine itself. The deeper revelation is that modern medicine may be standing in the middle of a massive paradigm shift involving the nervous system, inflammation, trauma, immunity, and chronic disease. For generations, disease was mostly viewed through separate categories. The brain was treated separately through the immune system. Mental illness was separated from inflammation. Autoimmune disease was separated from stress. Neurology was separated from psychiatry. The nervous system was separated from immunology. But the research now is beginning to collapse all of those freaking walls. The vagus nerve appears to regulate inflammation. Trauma appears to alter immune signaling. Depression may involve inflammatory pathways. Neurodegenerative diseases increasingly intersect with neuroinflammation. Long COVID resembles autonomic nervous system dysfunction. Cytokine storms involve cholinergic signaling pathways. Vitamin D influences alpha-7 receptor expression. Nicotine receptors appear throughout the immune system itself, naturally. And suddenly, medicine starts looking less like isolated body parts and more like one integrated electrical communications network. Well, that may be true, the true importance of this entire investigation. Nicotine may have accidentally, they knew, come on, let's not be stupid. In order to control people, you got to control the meds, you got to control the food. That's all so obvious. The issue that I have is finding the proof, but I did find the proof on this whole cover-up of nicotine and COVID. Not because nicotine is magical. It's not. Not because smoking was healthy. It's not. You're inhaling smoke in your lungs. But because nicotine strongly interacts with receptors already built into the body's neuroimmune architecture. And once researchers discovered those pathways, the scientific world quietly began moving toward them at full speed. That explains why vagus nerve stimulators, HRV monitoring, inflammatory psychiatry, bioelectronic medicine, neuroimmune therapies, and alpha-7 receptor research all began expanding simultaneously. You see, the body may not regulate inflammation through chemistry alone. It may regulate inflammation electrically through neural signaling networks connected directly to the autonomic nervous system. And that possibly changes everything. Because if chronic disease is partially driven by dysregulated communication between nerves, immune cells, inflammatory cytokines, stress systems, and autonomic balance, then modern life itself begins to look biologically disruptive in ways previous generations never fully understood. You know, chronic stress, artificial light, poor sleep, constant stimulation, sedimentary behavior, trauma, isolation, inflammatory diets, lack of sunlight, autonomic overload. This is America, folks. And all of these may gradually damage the body's ability to regulate inflammation and recovery through the nervous system. And that could explain why so many seemingly different diseases now appear connected underneath the surface. The most important thing tonight is not to replace one simplistic narrative with another, because the answer is not nicotine cures diseases. The answer is also not nicotine only exists to create addiction. You see, the truth emerging from the literature is more complicated and far more interesting than just simple, quick fixes. The nervous system may be one of the master regulators of human inflammation, immune response, and chronic disease itself. And decades ago, nicotine may have accidentally revealed the existence of that hidden system long before the scientific world, publicly, was ready to fully understand what it was looking at. So to conclude, tonight was never really about defending nicotine. Even though I chew it, I like it. It's all I got, folks. I can't do anything else. It's where it is. Am I going to go to hell for it? Well, What kind of angry God are we worshiping? What this investigation? Well, it's not also about, and it was never about promoting smoking. Okay? I don't promote smoking cigarettes. But what this investigation uncovered was something much larger, hiding underneath one of the most controversial molecules in modern history. And for decades, the public conversation about nicotine remained trapped inside a very narrow framework. Addiction, dependence, vaping, cigarettes, and public health warnings. But while the public discussion stayed frozen over there, the scientific world quietly kept moving forward towards nicotine receptors. And researchers continued uncovering evidence that nicotinic receptors sit inside a much larger system involving inflammation, vagus nerve signaling, trauma, autonomic regulation, neurodegeneration, immune communication, and chronic disease itself. And the deeper the research went, the more one conclusion kept appearing over and over and over and over again. That the nervous system and the immune system are not separate systems. They're deeply interconnected. The vagus nerve appears capable of regulating inflammatory cytokines. Alpha-7 nicotinic receptors appear throughout immune tissues and neural pathways. PTSD, depression, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, autoimmune disorders, AIDS, long COVID, and chronic inflammation all increasingly intersect with autonomic dysfunction and neuroimmune signaling. Now, that does not mean that nicotine is harmless. It does not mean everyone should start chewing nicotine gum. And it does not mean smoking was secretly healthy all along. But it does mean that the science is far more complicated than the public has ever been told. Because while society publicly wages war against nicotine, the medical world is quietly racing toward the receptor systems nicotine exposed decades ago. Pharmaceutical companies are building alpha-7 receptor drugs. Researchers are implanting vagus nerve stimulators. Bioelectronic medicine is expanding rapidly. HRV monitoring and autonomic regulation are becoming major fields of study. Inflammation is increasingly being viewed not only as a chemistry, but as electrical communication between the nervous system and immune system. And let's not forget that 40 countries now have banned nicotine from their country. It's coming here too, folks. And that may be the true revelation hiding underneath tonight's show. Modern disease may not simply be about isolated organs falling independently or failing independently. It may involve a breakdown in communication between the brain, immune system, inflammation pathways, autonomic nervous system, and stress regulation networks themselves. Well, that possibility changes how we view trauma, chronic stress, inflammation, depression, autoimmune disease, neurodegeneration, and even modern life itself. Because the same systems now appearing throughout these studies are the very same systems constantly disrupted by stress, poor sleep, artificial environments, isolation, inflammatory diets, lack of sunlight, sedentary behavior, and autonomic overload. Wow. Nicotine may have simply been the accidental doorway that exposed one of the hidden control systems of the human body. But it's not the answer, it's not the cure, but it's a big clue, folks. And perhaps the biggest lesson tonight is this. Sometimes science advances not by discovering entirely new systems, but by finally recognizing systems that were interacting in front of us all along.
This has been Cause Before Symptom with your host, James Carner. Go to his website, jamescarner.com, and sign up for his newsletter. Also, download his free books on the breath war, the crown of blood, and the ritual machine. Fix your body by buying his award-winning detox formula, removing heavy metals and parasites. You'll feel better and live longer. Go to elitepotion.com. And one more thing, please. Just try and love your neighbor, because if you do, the world would be a better place. See you tomorrow.